Hi everyone, welcome back to our live stream. So I'm Yating, and today we're gonna continue our discussion on the Russia-Ukraine war with Chao-Ting, of course. He is the creator of this platform, and today with our friend Dimitri.
Yeah. Hello everyone.
Hi. Dimitri is also a host of a YouTube channel and a Spotify. The name is Universal Wave Function, right?
Yes.
The one on YouTube is Universal Wave Function Politics. So,
yeah.
And he's from Russia. And if you have interest about the insightful perspective from Russian side on geopolitics or in general history, please subscribe his channel. And later we will put his link on the comments area. So, and I think like a couple of weeks ago, the Trump and Putin summit just finished without any results, like no ceasefire, no any agreement. Even though they say that they agreed it's a certain mutual understanding. And so today we want to continue these discussions and how the situation will lead after this summit. So for me, I personally don't really study too much about the contemporary geopolitics, even though my research, the economic reform and the socialist transition has a lot of relation with the geopolitics, but it's mainly focused on 1980s. So, but of course, I'm very curious about this topic. But my colleagues Chao-Ting and Dimitri, they are the experts on geopolitics. So today, I will act as a moderator, and then I will ask a couple of questions. Then they will give us some like insightful discussions on the situation. I mean, we are just small person. I know no one cares about us, but I think even though we are the early career researchers, our opinions, our research still matters. Maybe someone will notice that, right? So let's just start it. And I remember during our last discussion, Chao-Ting, you just mentioned that like the Donald Trump wanted to have a discussion or the ceasefire with Putin, and then Donald Trump kind of like forced Ukraine to stop this war. And I heard that some people think that it's kind of like a appeasement policy. So. But you mentioned that it's actually aligned with the long-term grand strategy of the US. So, would you like to make a further explanation of this perspective? Yeah.
Thank you, Yatin. Yes, I think the world has focused on the two summit meetings. The first one was in Alaska between Trump and Putin, and the second meeting took place in White House, Washington. Some European leaders, together with Zelensky, they have visited the White House. They have made talks with Donald Trump. So my general impression about the two conference is that they are neither New Munich nor New Yalta. Actually, before the Alaska meetings between Trump and Vladimir Putin, many observers had the concern that this conference could be New Munich. I think everyone understands what Munich means. Because maybe I can make a brief introduction. In 1938, Germany, I mean Nazi Germany and the British Empire and France, they had a secret meeting in Munich. Actually, they have sold, I mean both Britain and France have sold Czech Republic. Okay, so they have made some deals with Hitler. That means the weak countries can be sold by powerful countries. Like today, people are worrying about that Trump and Putin probably will make some deal, and the price could be Ukraine. Okay, so they have this concern, but nothing has happened. Trump has not made any deal with Putin, and some people made a conclusion about the meeting between Trump and Putin. It's called as the three no's. What does it mean? It means no deals, no details, and no questions. they have made one joint press conference, but they have just made a brief statement. They have not answered any question from the journalists. Okay, that means no questions. So for me, the two conferences are first good because the people are talking. I mean, the important decision makers are meeting with each other. Although there is no concrete outcome, but it's a good signal. It's a positive signal that the leaders are talking to each other. This is the first. And second, it's a pity that there is no deal. But I think they are starting to discuss ceasefire or peace deal seriously. I think the peace negotiation will be very difficult. It takes long time, but it's a positive signal that they have started to discuss the possibility of reaching any agreement. So again, the two conferences are neither New Munich nor New Yalta. Yalta conference, I'm not sure if our audience are aware of Yalta conference. I think it took place in 1944 in Yalta. Yalta is actually one part of the Crimea Peninsula. The three leaders of the Allies powers, I mean the former Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States, they meet together to discuss about the world order after World War II. That time it's clear that the Allies will win the war against the Axis, I mean Nazi Germany, Japan, and Italy. Okay, so the Allies leaders discussed the sphere of influence after World War II. That's why it's called as Yalta. Some people believe the leaders are dividing the world, and the world order after World War II is called as the Yalta system. Okay, but for me, the conference between Trump and Putin, the conference between Trump and the European leaders are neither New Munich nor New Yalta. This is my impression. We can discuss more details about the two conferences, but this is my general impression. It's a good beginning. It's a positive signal, but before they reach a peace deal, it has a long way to go. This is my general impression about the two conferences.
Of course, now I can just jump in.
I'm curious about your perspective. Russian,
comment as well. I mean, a few things. Of course, as you said, Shouting said, I think it's important to talk. And of course, this meeting definitely was overdue. It's something that I mean, the American Russian presidents, they last time before that, I mean, basically it was a meeting between Biden and Putin before the war in Ukraine. So of course it's long overdue. I mean, the meeting itself, of course, it was very theatrical, right? Something like there was a lot of interesting imagery with the bombers and just a lot of things like to share, because I guess Trump is all about is a theatrical way of doing politics in many respects. But of course, in the meeting itself, I think it didn't last long even. So it was a few hours of negotiations, and from my perspective, of course, it didn't. I mean, as I said before in our last conversation, I mean, I didn't expect much from the meeting itself. I mean, of course, it's just important first step in the process. And the thing I would say highlight after the conversation, after the talks between Putin and Trump, is the fact that Trump dropped the idea of ceasefire. So it's something that I think Putin made it clear that like Russia wouldn't really be interested in a ceasefire. So only ceasefire is a part of a stable peace agreement or long-term peace agreement. So something it was interesting that he changed his perspective. But then, of course, in there, from there it gets really complicated of who missed whose perspective, because a lot of people understand that there was some misinterpretation and miscommunication between them. Because Trump, famously after that, said that Russia agreed to security guarantees, and Russia said it never agreed to anything except for the fact that yes, we can consider security guarantees, but only if we would be part of the negotiation process over security guarantees. So there you could see what I study a lot this concept of course, misinterpretation. And I think the summit and the two summits and aftermath of those summits, they can embody this again misinterpretation, miscommunication, right? And then it's been already almost a month, right, since summit, and it seems there is not that much of a progress so far. And of course, it's just interesting to see how they square all those positions, because you have. You have Russian position, you have American position, and you have European position. After negotiations between Europeans and Trump, it was interesting to see that Trump is also, it doesn't lean as heavily towards Russian position. So again, there's a lot, of course, there that we do not know, because we don't know what's happening behind the closed doors. But from the information that I think we're getting, it's pretty clear that the negotiations are serious, or at least there are some certain stakes involved. But at the same time, I still have very little, hope that it will result in something productive, like so far. Because again, positions are way too far away. Yeah.
I'm also quite curious about your perspective as a Russian. How do you think of this wall strategically? Like, do you think Russian already lost from the strategy perspective?
Yeah. My core argument is that Russia basically wages the war in order to get access to the West, and I still kind of think this is what Russia means when it says we have to solve the root cause of the problem. And of course, after the meeting with Trump, Trump also had a lot of kind of rhetoric that symbolically was aimed at kind of aligning with the United States, again talking about friendship, about past achievements together, or common achievements in World War II. So something about interesting to see that despite even this whole animosity between Russia and the US, Putin still uses this kind of rhetorical language that was more reminiscent of 2000 rather than later decades, or 2010s even. So that's interesting again, because I think actually the whole process of miscommunication is due to the fact that the West doesn't really understand fully what Russia really wants from the West. It's something that they still need to. I guess they have to have way many more meetings to understand that, or at least in order to kind of pass the message, or to make the message clear. So this is my perspective, and of course there is also the war map, and it seems that Russia is moving the front line bit by bit, but it seems they almost captured at least is it Lugansk or Donetsk Republic? So they're very close to getting full control of those two regions. And I guess one of the prerequisites for peace deal from Russian side was that Ukraine immediately withdraws from those regions. Again, you can make your own assessment, but something that the front line is still moving. It's not really frozen. So it's also kind of course, it creates a certain tension in negotiations that gives Russia the upper hand in negotiation. Something that Russia uses, because Russian at least demands, they are maximalist, right? So they don't want to agree. Their demands are basically to get everything they want without no concessions to Ukrainians, right? So,
Dimitri, since you are Russia, so I want to ask you some questions because you have a Russia background. I think this is a good opportunity for both of us to understand Russian perspective.
Right.
Just now you have mentioned that Putin has said many times if the peace negotiation can be successful, all the stakeholders must solve the root cause of this war. what does it mean, root cause of this war?
I mean, I think at face value, the root cause would be a non-accession of Ukraine into NATO. It's something that, I mean, and of course, I mean, from my perspective, the way I read this message is this idea that they need to figure out what's Russian place in this European security architecture. Well, in other words, I think it's not that overstretched to say, when they say root cause of the problem, what they mean by that is like how to remake European security architecture where Russia is satisfied. So I think that's what they mean.
Thank you for your answer. I think Russia does not allow Ukraine to join NATO. This is understandable, and this is well known. Everybody knows. But you have also mentioned the security architecture of Europe. Can you make more explanation about the security architecture? My understanding is that Russia wants to have the veto power over the security architecture. If Russia does not agree any security arrangement, and then it will not be possible. This is similar to the membership of UN Security Council. I mean, there are 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. They have the veto right. I think Russia wants to have same power in the so-called European security architecture.
When I mention European security architecture, it's basically security architecture that developed after the end of the Cold War. And of course, its main facet was the expansion of NATO, like despite Russian objections. I mean, Russia basically wants to reverse this process. I mean, it wants to definitely guarantee that there would be no further expansion of NATO, either to Ukraine or Georgia or any other, I think, eastern countries in the east now. I mean, in the east of the European Eastern Europe, right? That's what I mean. So this is what I mean when they want to make changes of European security architecture, and of course they want to. And of course, I would argue that of course they want way much more than that. Of course, they want some sort of. I mean, what they call it themselves guarantees, right? They want guarantees. It's not. I mean, they very often they say they need guarantees as well. So, which means, I mean, there are many interpretations. I mean, the most basic one, they need a guarantee that NATO won't invade Russia. But one can also read in those guarantees something that Russia needs some assurance that it won't be completely excluded from Europe. Right, something that I, from my research, is pretty clear. So they're afraid of the scenario, and which is pretty achievable if you ignore Russia. A scenario where Russia is completely closed from other European countries, and in fact, if Ukraine joins, I would say, European Union and NATO, I mean, Russia would lose any leverage, right? Because then it's just. It doesn't have any connection to Europe except for maybe Belarus, but like Belarus, no one. It's not that big of a country, and no one really, would fight for Belarus. It's not that big of a deal. It's just a couple of millions of people, and not big of a country economically.
I understand. Both Russia and Ukraine want a security guarantee, but Russia is much more powerful than Ukraine. Let's suppose the peace negotiation is successful, and then Ukraine has a concern that in the future Russia possibly will attack Ukraine again. So I think from Ukraine perspective, security guarantee is the bottom line. So after the peace deal, Ukraine wants to have security guarantee, whatever it takes. Maybe it's not the membership of NATO. This is clear. Trump has made it very clear. It's not realistic for Ukraine to have NATO membership after the peace deal. But it can be something like Article 5 of NATO chapter, for example. If the peace deal is reached, some European armies will be stationed in Ukraine territory. Okay, so if Russia attacks Ukraine again, I think the European military forces will be involved. If they are involved, if they are attacked by Russian military forces, I think this will trigger NATO Article 5. Let's imagine if Germany sent soldiers to Ukraine soils. If German soldiers are attacked by Russian soldiers, I think this will definitely trigger Article 5 of NATO chapter. I think this is what Ukraine wants, but this will be very difficult for Russia to accept that. This is what I understand about the gap between Ukraine position and Russia position.
Yeah, that's definitely true, and I think Ukraine also still wants to get to NATO. It's still somewhat a delusional hope, but they still push hard. On that, and of course, the complexity of the issue is any guarantee that involves Europeans or Americans, stationing of American or European troops is sort of a NATO guarantee anyway. So it's kind of implied in the process. So it's really hard to understand how you create a solution where where guarantees are not from either the United States or Europeans, because it seems like Europeans wouldn't want to also commit to any war with Russia if Americans are not involved. Obviously that's kind of like a very risky for them scenario as well. Quite realistic, because without American guarantees, it's not that Russia would be that afraid of Europeans. And also another interesting point was that I guess Putin mentioned that he still doesn't want to cut Ukraine from Russia, because he said something that he still believes that Russia and Ukraine are not the same people. He said something that it's part of the same common, I would say, human space or something like that. I don't remember the exact wording, and it was in Russian. But something that's interesting that he said after a conference with Trump, and also I think it indicates that Russia is also doesn't want to agree to any type of peaceful scenario where Russia and Ukraine will be kind of permanently separated. Will become so it's still he has some hopes again. They would come up with an arrangement. I think where Russia would be also included in the process of again broader European security framework or European security space, where again the question of borders in the long term would be kind of irrelevant. So. But again, this is something that I can only, you can only guess.
What you are saying is very interesting. So this is very helpful for us to understand Russia's position, because we receive information from Western media, from Chinese media, but we don't really understand what Russia is thinking about this war. Just now you have mentioned the first point. Ukraine will not be allowed to join NATO. This is clear. Now, the Western countries, both Americans and Europeans are talking about Article 5 style security guarantee to Ukraine. It seems that Putin has accepted this idea during Alaska meeting, according to Trump's statement. But there is a problem. I think after the two conferences, Russia Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has made it very clear. Russia will not accept that Western countries send troops to Ukraine for the so-called peacekeeping. Russia does not accept Western soldiers on Ukraine territory. That means the security guarantee is very difficult. But this is the bottom line of Ukraine, I think. If there is any peace deal, I think Ukraine is waiting to make some compromise in terms of territory exchange, like Donbass. I think it's very difficult for them to withdraw from Donbass, but it's possible. It's possible if there is a security guarantee. But it seems that Russia is not willing to accept a Western security guarantee to Ukraine. I think this is the reason that the peace negotiation will be very difficult. And second, I think you have made one very important point about Korean's future position. Okay, you have made it clear that Russia is not happy that Ukraine will separate from Russia, probably the sphere of influence, right? So because I know something about the history. Actually, since 1654, I mean, since the 17th century, Ukraine is one part of the Russian Empire, either under the direct control of Moscow or one part of the sphere of influence of Russian Empire. So if the war is over, if the peace deal is reached, I think it's clear that Ukraine will be one part of EU, if not one part of NATO. Actually, Ukraine is already the candidate for EU membership. And politically and economically, Ukraine will be integrated into EU. This means Ukraine will not be one part of Russia's sphere of influence. For me, it's clear this is a biggest strategic failure of Russia since 1654. That means more than 370 years. That's why the peace negotiation will be very difficult if Ukraine will be joining the Western Bloc after the war. So because this will mean that Russia will lose Ukraine forever. Okay, since more than 370 years, this is tremendous strategic failure for Russia. So this will be very difficult.
It's pretty interesting because that's why it explains a lot why Russians are not really interested in achieving any type of agreement that just freezes the conflict. Because if they just freeze the conflict, they will lose Ukraine anyway. So what they want to do, and I mean, I call it like they kind of use Ukraine as a hostage. So it's like what they need to do is just to hold Ukraine until they can, basically. And for now, they can't hold Ukraine. I mean, and also because there are no real, to be honest, incentives for Russia to agree to peace deal. Because I mean, it seems no one really offered Russia anything substantial, right? Because no lifting of sanctions, no return to the Western, markets or anything like that. So it's something also that is, in a way, pending in the process. And that explains for me why, I mean, I don't expect, anything in the future from this negotiation process, because until there is a certain understanding what Russia wants, and it definitely doesn't want just to take part of Ukrainian land. I don't think that's part of the strategic calculation, so to speak, or strategic rationale. What they really want is like to have Ukraine as a part of the broader negotiation process. And so what they need to do, maybe kind of like a new Yalta, right, or something like this, where Russia, could have a say in a broader security framework, or it can really drive certain changes in the world or something like this. So that's what they want at least. It's not guaranteed that they will get it, but I mean that's what at least they aspire to do, and that's why they just peace for the peace sake. It's not really interesting for Russians.
Since you mentioned that if Ukraine will be part of the EU, and then we all live in Germany, so I'm thinking like what can be the impact on Europe, the Europe in the future, that because I heard there's opinion that due to the terrible economic situation in Ukraine, and then if the EU conclude Ukraine as part of the EU member, it's gonna be a economic burden for the EU in the future. But there's also a type of opinion that the Ukraine has a very huge potential market, so it's actually gonna be another economic huge market, for EU to, particularly for Germany or France, to extend their products or just promote their products, and then on the other turn, like they just boost the economic growth in Europe. So, what about your opinion of this?
It's still hard for me to believe that. I mean, the Russians would probably allow Ukraine to join EU if they see see that there is a solution to their problem. Yeah. And then, of course, I think they will use Ukraine in the process. It's the same way they use it now with the war. So they would say, well, you can accept Ukraine. You can accept Ukraine in the European Union if you open markets for Russia as well. Not necessarily accept Russia to European Union, because I don't think that's what Russia wants at all. But I mean, Russia wants European market, like a free market. I mean, they wanted it since 90s. So it's like they would say, oh, okay, then we can talk. So only if this scenario is possible, that's what we can get.
And another question was about like the strategy for Europe, because now if Donald Trump forced he seek for the ceasefire, and there is an opinion that he wanted to turn towards the east, and we're going to talk about this later. And then I remember that he complained that Europe has to take their own responsibility. So is there some like a potential impact on Europe or Germany? I'm thinking, I mean, maybe I briefly explain my perspective, I think, because nowadays, like, America is very huge of the debt burden, and then they are not able to take the responsibility as what we call as the world police. So, and now they kind of want to, because they're saying that they want to focus on the east, and then that's why. But in the past, the U.S. is kind of act as the police for the whole Europe, and then for Germany, like they basically rely too much on the U.S. to protect the security. So and now is and also because of the historical past for Germany, that the U.S. didn't really allow Germany to have like a strong military, and but nowadays, if the war, let's just say that there is a really negotiation continued, and then the possible ceasefire, and then I was thinking maybe then it's the time for Europe to build their strong military again, and of course Germany as the strongest economic power in Europe, they're gonna be powerful again. So from like if we discuss it from a grand strategy, it couldn't be a bad thing, but of course, but in another way that it could be a very huge economic burden for Europe, because like once, even though there's a ceasefire between Russia and then Europe or Ukraine, but then you still have to devote a lot of budget into the military, and we know that the current economic situation in Europe is getting actually worse, and then Europe was quite backward in like some new technology. So like AI, and then if they continue to devote too much budget into military, and then there's a thing that Germany cannot afford it for the welfare state anymore. So I think it's kind of like a dilemma for Europe.
With the Europeans, it's interesting because, I mean, to be honest, I don't know what's going on in their minds, because they seem very... I mean, their policy is really counterproductive. It has been counterproductive for many years. Because before the war in Ukraine, before the war started in 2022, I mean, Europe was a counterbalance to American influence, and in a way, it tried to promote good relationship with Russia in order to balance like aggressive, like American stance on Russia. But like their policy failed because, I mean, because American pushed too hard in this kind of anti-Russian direction. And now they try to fulfill the position of America to be more anti-Russian, even though America seemingly just realized itself that, their policy was probably a failure. So I struggle to understand, and of course there is a lot of, I have a suspicion that this is sort of like, what people call in international relations like a blob. In a way, it all comes down to this Brussels dominated circles, so people who have like this weird approach to politics, like from very ideological perspective, where they completely ignore like a certain, I would say reality. So just realities in politics about changing world, about Europeans need to have a certainly good relationship with Russia. It's certainly that, and now they kind of try to fulfill this position of anti-Russian protagonist, even though this position, I mean, it failed even for Americans, I mean, who were way much more powerful. So I mean, if I were to guess, I mean, Russians actually don't believe that this is a sustainable position. So they expect Europeans to break a certain point because it is something that even Americans couldn't sustain for that long. And then Europeans also have a lot of problems. I mean, eventually they need Russian gas. They will come to this realization because, you know, their economies, they don't perform that well. And then, of course, there is a growing populism. And in a way, of course, there are a lot of experts who would argue that, you know, Russia want to kind of like have a chaos in Europe. So then at Europe, like, there would be like a further rise of nationalism in Europe with AfD and stuff like this. So, you know, it can change its just policy orientation. So something that, you know, to keep in mind. Yeah.
I think you have raised one very important question related to Europe. On Chinese social medias, people are always nothing on European people. They claim that Europe is weak and not united, no solidarity. They have done nothing to support Ukraine concretely like the Americans have done, because Europeans are militarily weak, politically not united, and culturally they are too liberal. And they are not determined to resist the power of American, or Russian, or Chinese. For Chinese, for many Chinese, I mean, for the ordinary Chinese people, even some scholars and experts, Europe is just a joke. But I think it's wrong. First, I think Europeans are still very powerful. They have hard power, military power, like the French. They have nuclear aircraft carrier. Until now, China has no nuclear driving aircraft carrier. Of course, Americans have, French have, and the French and the British people have nuclear weapons as well. So I think the Europeans are strong in terms of hard power, and they are also very strong in terms of soft power, because Europeans, together with Americans, have created the so-called liberal international order after World War II. And many international organizations have headquarters in Europe, like in Geneva or the Vienna. And the Europeans have created a lot of international norms and regulations. I mean, in terms of both hard power and soft power, the Europeans are very strong, and I think European countries are determined to support Ukraine in this war. Even the American decided to withdraw its support from Europe. I think Europeans are still determined to support Ukraine. Why? Because first, from an ideological perspective, they believe the foundation of the international order after World War II is that no countries are allowed to change the border with military force. So they believe Russia's aggression has violated the foundation of the international order. I mean, this is from the ideological or international law perspective. And from security perspective, because many European countries are worrying about the possible aggression from Russia. If Russia can seize the whole Ukraine, for example, the Baltic countries, so they are very worried about this possibility. And Poland and maybe Moldova, they will follow Ukraine. So even Germany, I think Berlin is not far away from Kaliningrad, and even Germany, they are thinking about the possibility that by the end of 2027, Russia will be ready to test the determination of NATO countries. Even Germans have such a concern. So this is from the security perspective and from the economic perspective. I think we have discussed Ukraine is an important country when it comes to economy, because Ukraine is huge. Ukraine is the second largest European country. Ukraine is much larger than Germany, and Ukraine has tremendous natural resources. And the people of Ukraine are well educated. They can be very good workforce for European companies. So I think from the ideological, security, and economic perspective, Ukraine is an important country for EU, for European countries. We should not forget that Germany has occupied Ukraine twice, during World War I and World War II. And during World War II, Hitler has sent a lot of German troops to seize Ukraine because Hitler Germany needed the natural resource of Ukraine to continue this war against the Soviet Union. This means Ukraine is really important to European countries when it comes to economy, right? So this is my understanding. And I do believe Europeans are determined to support Ukraine, even without American support. Europeans will continue to support Ukraine economically, militarily, and morally. They will continue. I think European countries are not a joke. I think the Chinese, especially Chinese experts, have underestimated the determination of Europeans. They have made a mistake, and I think Chinese are continuing to make the mistake because they look down the Europeans. They look down the Europeans. I think this is wrong.
Like the one thing, I guess, that is important to notice. I mean, it's interesting to see how long this consensus will last and whether like this idea will be sustainable again for a long time, for a decade, for example, because it seems that European elites, they are definitely losing support of people. And then, of course, you have, I mean, with, AfD in Germany rising up to almost 30% of population, and, also in France as well. And it takes only either France or Germany to reverse its course, I would say, to completely reverse the whole EU process, or process of, I could say, if not unification, but aligning of positions inside the EU in order to have a more, I would say, to have a strong, unified geopolitical position. So something, I guess, to keep an eye on, because it seems that the more they persist in this idea of having like a unified geopolitical player as European Union, the more it runs in contrast to like desires for just ordinary people, I would say so. But again, something just to look, just to take a look in further upcoming elections and so on and so forth.
Just one question came to my mind because during the last election in February, we noticed that there's a fact that the rise of the right wing in Europe in general, And what I heard is that it's actually a global right wing, that they actually feel like sympathy for Russia, for Putin, then somehow consider like the Putin is like an idol, like the symbol of the right wing. So I mean, I don't really have a clear answer for this situation. I was thinking like, is it like the global, how was the right wing in Europe actually think about this war? What I heard that, like, for example, like AfD, they kind of think they ask for like stop the war, or what is not only AfD, just like in general the right wing in Europe, like, do they have some different position to the war or to the future strategy towards the Russia in after, let's say that, like after something happened?
They are certainly more sympathetic to Russia in general, and I mean, they want to, I would say, restore relations with Russia. I mean, because it's also for Germany, Russia would be the only source of like this cheap energy, without which Germany, I mean, seemingly cannot really sustain any productive economic growth. Just because it simply doesn't work that well, because just the numbers don't sum up. So this is of course like one thing to keep in mind. So they're really significantly more sympathetic. But of course, I don't think if they come to power, they would, like flip-flop 180 degrees, and they would be like that willing to, negotiate with Russians. They most likely will also, kind of, I would say, migrate more to the center. But they will definitely be like Trump, because, Trump also kind of had like this platform where he seemingly was very favorable to Russians. But once he actually became president, it's not that easy, even if he personally is very sympathetic to Putin, to go and negotiate with Russians and just to agree to Russian demands. So I think it will be very similar in this way. But once you have, at least for example, if you have AfD winning in Germany and you have like Trump in the office in the US, of course it increases the chances that some agreement will be reached.
Again, I think this is an important question. I think this is related to the ideological dimension of the global struggle.
Right.
Today, the right-wing populists are rising, not only in the United States, but also in European countries, like in Germany. We are very clear the AfD alternative for Germany is rising. Probably they are already the #1 political force.
Right.
After last general election, AfD has become the #2, the second most powerful political party in Germany after the Union. But according to some opinion survey, now AfD is probably #1. They are the most powerful political party in Germany. So I think this is a global phenomenon of the rise of the right-wing ideology, both in the United States and Europe. I just want to analyze the situation from a perspective of big picture. I mean, not only in West countries, but also in Russia, in China, and many other countries. The conservative right-wing ideologies is rising. Actually, Russia has promoted conservatism since long time. Putin took office in 1999, I think. So he has been in power for almost 25, 26 years. So Putin is a symbol of a right-wing conservative ideology because Russia has claimed, as many ideologists like Alexander Dugin has made it very clear, the liberalism is weak but also dangerous, and the liberalism is against Russia and China, and Russia wants to be a promoter of traditional conservative ideology, like the family, like the society, like the community, because they attack the Western liberalism for focusing on individual interests rather than the collective interests. They believe liberalism is a dangerous ideology. We should look at the Russia-Ukraine war from ideological dimension as well. So I think between Russia and the Western countries, there is a huge conflict when it comes to ideology, because Russia is promoting right-wing conservative ideas, and Ukraine is fighting on behalf of liberalism. This is the ideological dimension of this war. Probably it's true. I think today, if we are talking about Western countries competing against the so-called global East. Global East, they believe China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran belong to the so-called global East. They claim China is neither global North nor the global South, but global East. I think they are competing against each other, not only for economic interests and sphere of influence, but also for the ideas. For the ideas, I think China also belongs to the bloc of conservative ideas. China does not like liberalism either, like Russia. Okay, so I think if we want to understand this world better, we have to think about the ideological dimension.
When you mentioned the liberalism, so it just came to my mind about like the new liberal and the liberalism, because for the global right wing, I remember like there's historian Queen Slobodian. He wrote the book about I think Hayek's Bastard about the global right wing. He is a historian, but he has the interest of the history of neoliberalism. And then he actually mentioned that the global right wing actually feel sympathy for Russia, for China, because they really think that state capitalism is a really good or best form of capitalism. You know, like they think like the country like Europe, who dominated by the left wing, are not really liberal economy. It's not a free market because there's so many what was it called like the government like monitor. So the government stayed too much in the free market. So that's why like there's one point, because I think liberalism or the right liberalism is kind of different. I think like because the right wing, they also consider themselves like we are liberals because we want to maintain the free market, and then it's just remind me like, is this Russian-Ukraine war actually marked the another turn point for the global economic order? For example, like we know that currently the liberal, what we call the new liberal order, is actually emergence after the Cold War. Like these new liberal economists entered into the East Europe and the Soviet Union, and then they kind of like have the shock therapy. So, but nowadays, like the Russian-Ukraine war is actually, because there is like a union. We know there is not like a actual like a union of the Russian or the global East, but they actually kind of like doing something against for the so-called like the left-wing liberalism, and then they consider themselves that we are trying to defend the free market, and but because they were so angry with the neoliberal economic order that's set by the US and then Europe, because they think that they were excluded from this this order. So that's what it's just it's not really a question. It's actually something that I was thinking. This how do you think about this economic order in the future?
It's an interesting point you raised, and certainly, I guess, even with the first Trump term, kind of like the U.S. actually reached this point where it realized for itself that the liberal economic model, neoliberal economic model, wasn't really sustainable for for just a longer time frame. So it decided to retract and kind of to reorient itself. To reorient the whole American model, because all those debates, they're based upon this idea of what type of model America will pursue in the future. And of course, like with the Trump winning the second term, what many people looked at like as an aberration turned out to be more or less a sustainable, more or less a long-term American strategy in planning into kind of kind of bringing back production to the US, and of course changing the model. And you can also think about EU as kind of this last counterbalance to that, because of course EU promotes this neoliberal model still, and how it plays out. I mean, I'm not sure yet because I haven't thought about that, I would say, that deeply, but I think I would always look at America as a kind of example of whether you can sustain this model or not. Because if America doesn't want to sustain this model, I mean, I don't think it's that feasible for the future.
Yeah. Again, important question. So, you are talking about economic order. Yeah. Because this is a huge topic. So I want to talk something related to today's concrete topic, Russia-Ukraine war, together with the economic order. I mean, economic order is a theoretical issue, but it's also practical issue. Let's imagine after the war between Russia and Ukraine, probably there will be a ceasefire. Probably it will be similar to Korean War. Korean War, I mean, all the parties have reached a ceasefire deal, but no peace agreement. But the peace has been in place for more than 70 years, I think. I think probably the Russia-Ukraine war will be similar to the Korean War. I mean, there will be a ceasefire. After some time, I think there will be a ceasefire, maybe no peace deal, but a ceasefire is possible. I'm thinking about the scenario after this war. I think Ukraine will definitely join the EU. Actually, I have mentioned Ukraine has started the process. Ukraine is already the candidate of EU membership together with Moldova. So I mean, after this war, Ukraine will be integrated into EU economic zone. There will be huge European investments to Ukraine, and I think the Ukraine economy will prosper, and Ukraine will benefit from being one part of a European economic community. Actually, all the other Eastern European countries, I mean Central and Eastern European countries, they were previously one part of the Soviet bloc, but after 1991, I think all of them have joined the EU and NATO. Actually, all of them have benefited from the membership of EU and NATO. For example, Poland, Hungary. Other Eastern European countries, even Romania, Bulgaria, and the Baltic countries, like Poland, I think Poland is not a rich country. That's why the Ukraine have so strong motivation to join the Western blocs, because this means a huge economic interest, and they will become rich. Right now, they're the poorest country in Europe, maybe the second poorest country of Europe. So they have very, very strong motivation, even with the Russia opposition, okay? Even with the danger that they will be attacked by Russia. Russia is a superpower, okay? Russia is very powerful, but they are not afraid of Russia aggression, okay? So, I mean, Ukraine has very strong motivation to be integrated into the European community. I mean, after war, the military fight will be changed to economic competition. And this will not be good for Russia, because Russia is not very good at economic development from my perspective. That's why Russia wants to avoid that Ukraine will be one part of the Western countries, the EU or NATO, because Ukraine will become rich, and this will be a danger for Russian people. Ukrainian people become much richer, and Russian economy is slowing down, and the economic prospect is not very positive. That's why they want to stop the process that Ukraine will join the EU. So this is from the economic perspective. I think this can explain why Russia is against that Ukraine wants to be one part of EU, because this will make Russia in a bad situation. Russia is not one part of the European economic community, but Ukraine will be one part of that community. So this is not good for Russia.
Well, just remind me, like, kind of what we call like wall economy, that when we look at the economic number in Russia since 2023, that the GDP was actually growing to, I think, 3.6. In 2024, I think it's raised to like 4%, but it's getting slower down in 2025. But of course, it's still like a higher number than that in Europe. So I'm thinking like it sounds like, the wall actually accelerated the economic growth, for the country, for the government that has already faced the legitimacy crisis. If they create some like a certain economic growth, it can maybe, actually it shows that the government did something like useful. Then it just reminds me like it's like this wall actually like give some other countries example that maybe we can like boost create some like economic growth by launching the wall. So I was thinking like the potential impact on China, of course, also from the grand strategy that it's I think it's already very obvious, like the American defense ministers, I think it's him that mentioned that now the US has to only focuses on the East, not just the West. So I think the current situation may be quite crucial for China. And then even though China didn't really discuss much about the Trump-Putin summit, but I think China is quite nervous right now because I was kind of thinking like China hope this war can continue because like China could benefit some from this war. Yeah.
I mean, Russia launched this war either because Russia definitely has a certain proclivity to be more to just behave in a very crazy way, I would say, because it's something that, if anything, it's a negative example of how you shouldn't behave. Or Russia was just very desperate because the time was running, and probably in 2022 there was now a never event because things could have gone. Russia could have lost even that position that it felt it still had enough power to wage a war. So this is, and I think, in general, of course, from my knowledge, like a very surface level knowledge of Chinese involvement in foreign markets, of course, for China it would be probably way much more devastating than for Russia, because Russia has been already sanctioned for like 7 years before that. So the ties between the West and Russia were actually already severely broken anyway. So for Russia in 2022, there was also an important thing to consider because there was nothing there for Russia to save because the ties were already broken. It's like, and anyone knew like with a certain just a minimal knowledge of dynamic between Russia-West relations, that West would never improve this relationship with Russia anyway. So in 2022, there was nothing for Russia to lose. Of course, they lost even more, so to speak, they lost even that access that they had, but they also knew that there was nothing to gain from the West anyway. So of course, China is a very different case because China hasn't, from my knowledge, of course, there are tariffs and all this economic war between China and the US. But of course, China still heavily relies on foreign exports, and it's something that China doesn't want to lose access to foreign markets. Something that will probably be detrimental. And also, from what I've heard about Chinese, thinking, it is definitely way much more strategic and deliberate. And if China were to act, it wouldn't be in that fashion that Russia did, where Russia definitely acted with. Kind of plunged into abyss. It didn't really have a certain plan. It just tried to do one thing, then it failed, and then it tried to do another thing. But it was like a very risky and just risky endeavor. So from my understanding of China, I think China would probably try to do the same with Taiwan when it's certain that at least it could achieve certain quick results, and it is certain that it could handle the pressure from the Americans.
When it comes to Chinese position on this war, I think this is an interesting topic and a little bit sensitive from Chinese perspective. As Chinese, if we are talking about the Chinese position on Russia-Ukraine war, I think previously, there was one big news that Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited Brussels. He has told his counterpart Kaja Kallas that China cannot afford that Russia will lose this war because the Americans will then shift to Asia and focus on China. American will shift its resource and attention from Europe to the so-called Indo-Pacific, and China will be the main target. That's why China cannot afford a Russia failure. China will continue to support Russia. Maybe a Russia victory is not good for China either, but a Russia failure is definitely not good. So China wants to avoid this worst scenario. I think China's position on this war is very complicated. From my perspective, if this war continues, this is in the interest of China, because that means both Europeans and Americans are focusing on Ukraine, and their resource and their attention, their power will be in Europe rather than Asia. This will be good for China. And on the other hand, maybe, I don't know, it's complicated because a powerful Russia is not in the interest of China either. A powerful Russia is also a threat for China. I think this is China's position. Actually, many Chinese people, including some Chinese experts, have joked about the Europeans. Just at the very beginning, I have mentioned that they joked that the Europeans are not on the table. You know, the former Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said you are either on the table or on the menu. Chinese people laughed at the Ukrainians. They are on the menu, but Europeans are not on the table because Trump and Putin are holding talks directly without the involvement of Europeans and without the involvement of Ukraine. So that means Ukraine will be sacrificed by the Western countries, and the Europeans are too weak to be on the table. But actually, the situation is different. I think this joke is wrong. I think Europeans are on the table and Ukrainians are not on the menu. The problem is that now Chinese are not on the table. If you are looking at the situation, the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Americans, and the Europeans, all of them are involved in these peace talks. All of them are discussing with each other, and they make some negotiation, compromise, or demands, whatever. But they are involved. But China is not involved. Actually, China is a strong supporter of Russia, according to NATO. China is a decisive enabler of Russia. But China is not involved. Actually, China does want to be involved. In 2023, February, 1 year after the war broke out, China has issued one open statement about this war. China has 12 points about this war. And actually, China wanted to mediate the peace negotiation. China has sent a special diplomat to Russia, to Ukraine, and to Europe with the purpose, with the aim of mediating the peace negotiation. This is clear that China wants to be involved. China wants to be on the table. But now China is excluded from the table. I think China is unhappy. China is unhappy with that. So the situation is very complicated. If we are talking about this war, I think we have to have a picture of global struggle. I think it's clear that the Sino-American strategic competition is the highest priority of China. China's position on this war is very US-centered. Very US-centered. For China, Europeans are not important. Russians, I don't know. Russians are probably important, but Americans are much more important. So if American attention and resource can continue to be dragged into this war, this will be good for China. I think position of China is very complicated. They want to continue this war, but on the other hand, the official position of China is that they want to have peace immediately. But in reality, I think the motivation could be much more complicated.
Then there's just like another question that's about the triple relation between China, Russia, and then the U.S. And then I heard there's some scholar, I think Chinese scholar, mentioned that it could be a reversed version of Kinsk in 1971. You know, that one back then, like the U.S. United China wanted to against the Russian, the Soviet Union, but nowadays they're saying that the U.S. wanted to united Russia to focus on China, and then so what's your opinion on this? And because of course some people is not agree with this, like for example Qin Hui, he said it's totally wrong because the situation, the relation between Russia and China was totally different way that back then in the 1970s of China and the Soviet Union, the relation was already deteriorated. It's because the U.S. has the motivation to unite with Russia.
Yeah. I think this is interesting. This is a so-called this is a so-called U.S., China, Russia strategic triangle. Okay. Yeah. Of course, the Americans have the motivation to separate Russia from China because Russia is militarily strong. Russia has tremendous natural resource, and Russia is huge. Russia is the biggest country in the world, especially on the Eurasia continent. And the Chinese are good at economy and technology, and Chinese military forces are becoming increasingly stronger and stronger. And China is now the #1 strategic competitor of the U.S. So of course, the U.S. has very strong motivation to separate the partnership between Russia and China if it's not nice. And Trump has made it very clear. Trump has said it very clear. Russia has huge land, and China has huge population. China wants to have the land of Russia, and they are naturally enemies. And Trump has said, I'm a student of history. I know it very clear. Russia must be separated from China. He has expressed his motivation, and there are a lot of analysis about the so-called reverse Nixon, reverse or Kissinger. You have mentioned. From my perspective, first it will be very difficult because the first separate between China and the Soviet Union, I mean, in 1960s, since 1960, I mean the so-called Nixon-Kissinger process. That time there was huge conflict between China and the Soviet Union, ideological conflict and even military fight. There was military fight between China and the Soviet Union. That's why it's possible for the U.S. to separate China from the Soviet Union. They have achieved that purpose. Okay, it's very successful, and China has changed its position, and China has supported the U.S. To fight a Cold War against the Soviet Union, and finally, the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, the Nixon-Kissinger process was very successful, but now if the Americans want to replicate this process to separate Russia from China, this will be very difficult because right now the relationship between China and Russia is very good, and the leaders, Chinese leaders and the Russian leaders, seem to trust each other, and they are cooperating. They support each other. Maybe they coordinate very well. So, I mean, the circumstances are very different from previously. This is #1. #2, Russia and China have a common opponent or rival, Americans. This is a so-called American hegemony. So they want to be against the American hegemony. So there is a foundation for Russia-Chinese partnership. Okay, this is the second point. But nothing is impossible. Right now, nothing is impossible because Russia is a great power. Russia has its own interests, its own position. I don't think Russia want to be the Julian partner of China. Russia does not want to be the Julian partner of anyone. Russia does not want to be the Julian partner of the Western countries. But actually, Russians admire Western civilization. Russia want to be integrated into Western civilization since Peter the Great. Okay, but even though Russia does not want to be the Julian partner of the Western countries, Russia has always challenged the dominance of Western countries. I mean, Russia is a very proud nation. They don't want to be the Julian partner of anyone, even the Western civilization. So, are Russia willing to be Julian partner of Chinese? I doubt that. Right now, Russia seems to be the Julian partner of China if you are talking about economic power and the population. Russia is only 10% of China. So, I think Russia is a proud country, proud people. They don't want to be the Julian partner of China, but this is not a reality. That means there is still a room for Americans to play. Maybe Russia will not be the friend of the US. Russia will not be the enemy of the Chinese, but Russia can be more neutral than now. Today, Russia and China work together closely, and they coordinate. One Chinese leader has told Russia counterpart that China and Russia are coordinating in this war. The Chinese leader Li Zhanshu has told his counterparts, the leader of Russia Duma. Trump has made tiny progress. He has met with Putin in Alaska. I think this will make Beijing very sensitive. Putin has visited the United States, and he is waiting to meet Trump in the American soil. It seems that they are very happy with each other. And from ideological perspective, I think Trump is a friend of Putin. But from geopolitical perspective, of course, Trump is the president of the U.S. U.S. has its own national interests. But if you are talking about ideology, I think Trump is also a representative of the right-wing conservative ideas. And for me, Putin is a leader, a spiritual leader of the global conservative ideology. I mean, the relationship is very complicated, but it's possible that Americans can make Russia more neutral. At least Russia will not be ally of China or Julian partner of China. This is still possible.
From my perspective, yeah, it's also important to notice that it's hard to imagine that Russians would actually trust Americans in the nearest future, just because the amount of perceived betrayal they experienced from Americans, I guess, again, with their promise not to expand NATO and so on and so forth. And also, of course, learning from maybe history, because eventually the Kissinger reversal, it worked short term for America, meaning it aligned China and it aligned China with the US against the Soviet Union. But long term, it created actually for America even bigger problem, because China became this bigger problem due to the access to foreign markets, and of course, American perceived idea that China will reverse its kind of course just because of the market economy, and kind of didn't realize. So it's something that also to keep in mind if they ever consider this reversal. They will definitely be afraid of Russia again, just gaining certain material wealth, and then turning this material wealth into hard power in Europe. So something just came to my mind, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your perspective. So, yeah, I think today, we already reached to multiple perspectives on this Russian-Ukraine war, and then I think we already discussed over 1 hour. So, yeah, for me, we discussed about the perspective of this war, and then for me, it's possible that we, the Americans' hegemony is possible to be ended, and then we're gonna to reach a multiple world, kind of like the 19th century. So I'm not sure, but I'm thinking, okay, but today I think maybe it's time to end this discussion, and then of course I'm happy to continue this discussion sometime, but today I think we already ran out most of the time. And then would you like to make a conclusion?
I mean, again, just looking into the future, I still have doubts that we will have any significant result in the upcoming months. If anything, the process will take a long time, and again, for me, the problem is primarily some misunderstanding between two parties. So it will take some time to align them. It's not something that will happen very fast. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. In terms of the battlefield, I think Russians and Ukrainians, both of them still have power and resource to continue the fight. There is a huge gap between Russian position and the Ukrainian position. That's why it's still very difficult to reach a peace deal. Trump is working very hard to mediate the peace negotiation, but he has understood that this will be very difficult. And I think before he took office in January, he believed this will be very easy task to end this war. He claimed that he can end this war in 24 hours, but now he has realized the situation is very difficult, and this is a very difficult task, and we have analyzed this war from economic, political, and security perspective, and we have also discussed the impact of this war on Europe and China, and we have also analyzed the Chinese position and the Chinese calculation on this war. So it's very complicated. For me, I think this war is very similar to the Korean War. Not only the beginning, but also the end. Probably the end will be similar to Korean War. I mean, ceasefire instead of permanent peace deal. Ceasefire is possible, but peace deal can be very difficult because Ukraine will never accept that Crimea and other Korean territories will be one part of Russia. They will never accept that. And for Russians, it's also very difficult to accept that Western troops will be stationed on Korean soil. So I mean, the gap between the two countries, I mean, is too big. But I think any war will be over. Any war will be over, and any war will be ended on the negotiating table. And now they have started the negotiation. This is a positive signal. It depends on the diplomatic efforts and the military fight on the battlefield.
Thank you so much for the discussion, and for answering my questions. I really learned a lot because this is not really my expertise. So but now you extend my broaden my eyes when my knowledge about this evolves. So thank you so much. And then I think it's time to end this discussion. And bye, YouTube.
Bye bye.